Hello and welcome to Euro Football Daily, where today we're looking at 10 horrible ideas which destroyed the finances of football clubs. 10. Parma. Parma's full name may be Parma Calcio 1913, but if they're honest, the club's real founding date is 2015. That's because they've gone bankrupt 3 times, most recently 6 years ago, when they failed to pay tax on salaries, eventually receiving a points deduction and having to restart life in Serie D after running up €200 million in debt. But that's not even the biggest humiliation in the side's recent history. In the late 90s, the Giallo-Blu were a club on the up, winning 2 UEFA Cups and finishing second in Serie A in 1997 under Carlo Ancelotti, while producing stars like Buffon, Cannavaro, Crespo and Thuram. But trouble was brewing. Owners Parmalat, a multinational food and dairy corporation, were desperately trying to raise money, and in 2004 it was discovered that CEO Callisto Tanzi, also a club exec, had embezzled €800 million, providing false accounts for both Parmalat and Parma, and ultimately running up €14 billion in debt, the largest European bankruptcy ever. Slipping out of Italy's top 6 for the first time in over a decade, the team was placed in administration for 3 years and spent the subsequent era yo-yoing between first and second tiers before the taxman returned in 2015. 9. Derby County. At 137 years old, Derby County are one of the world's oldest football clubs and part of the game's heritage. So something was lost forever when the Rams announced they were entering administration in September 2021, a move which carries with it a 12-point deduction, a potential kiss of death for a side which only avoided relegation last term by 1. That's not the first such punishment Derby have faced this year, after they narrowly avoided a 9-point loss for breaching spending regulations. But the instability runs deep into the actual ground they play on. Having spent heavily to fight for promotion after businessman Mel Morris bought them in 2015, the Rams eventually sold their stadium to him and leased it back at half the cost to cover mounting debts, but still sank into an economic hole after failing to reach the Prem. Debate rages over how much Morris tried to hide their woes after a refusal to submit their accounts to the Football League saw new boss Wayne Rooney slapped with a transfer ban this summer, leaving him at one stage with just 9 players on the books. Following 2 failed takeovers, one by the cousin of Man City owner Sheikh Mansour, Morris decided to place the club in administration, claiming to have sunk £200 million into it over the last half-decade. We doubt that'll help him with the Pride Park faithful. 8. Barcelona. How do you go from one of the best teams ever and starting 7 academy graduates in the 2011 UCL final to whatever Barcelona are now? The Blaugrana made history in 2018 when they surpassed $1 billion in yearly revenue, but spent the summer of 2021 conducting a fire sale and negotiating contract reductions as years of terrible spending came back to bite them. Oh, and they lost the greatest player of all time for free. Since 2011, Barca have spent £1.33 billion on transfers, but seen a steady decline in the squad's quality, largely due to a haphazard process which took input from the club president, coach, sporting director, and even Messi himself. Poor at negotiating, they paid twice the asking prices for Dembele and De Jong, chose to sign unsuitable players like Griezmann and Braithwaite rather than keeping their powder dry, and, according to the Financial Times, between 2017 and 2021 handed Leo Messi over €500 million in wages, not to mention committing to a costly revamp of the Camp Nou. So when Covid came, they were stuck with a poor squad overloaded with aging, highly paid stars, whom they had to beg to reduce their salaries. It worked in the short term, but Barca finished 3rd last season for the first time since 2008 and will be paying players their outstanding wages long past retirement. The future remains uncertain for the Catalans. 7. Portsmouth. It's hard to imagine League One's Portsmouth as a team which was once good enough to sell players to Inter Milan and Real Madrid, but in the late 2000s Pompey were flying. Promoted to the Prem in 2003 under Harry Redknapp, the side invested in talent like Peter Crouch, Jermaine Defoe and Lassana Diarra, and in 2008 won the FA Cup, giving them European football for the first time in their history. Unfortunately, that success was built on sand. Club finances were famously slapdash, with Redknapp earning 5% of player sales and £60 million owed to external financiers, and Harry's preference for experienced stars like Kanu, Sol Campbell and Andy Cole inflated the wage bill to £55 million by 2008, more than Man City and Spurs. So when the 2008 financial crash hit, owner Alexandre Gaidamak was forced to sell, offloading the club to Sulaiman Al Fahim, an Emirati property magnate who turned out to have stolen the £5 million down payment he made for Pompey from his wife, and subsequently went to prison. Another takeover was eventually agreed, but by then the Premier League had placed a transfer ban on Portsmouth due to a failure to pay player wages. They went into administration in 2010 under their fourth owner in 18 months, were docked 9 points and left their glory days behind them. 6. Fiorentina. Purple, Nintendo, Gabriel Batistuta's hair. If there was one team everyone loved in the 90s, it was Fiorentina, the entertaining underachievers led by the Argentinian and Rui Costa, who rose from second-tier ignominy to the Champions League, handing historic defeats to then superpowers Arsenal and Manchester United as they made names for coaches like Ranieri and Mancini. Still, you're not really an Italian club if you're not owned by a wealthy weirdo, and La Viola were no exception, with their funds coming from Vittorio Cecchi Gori, a two-time Oscar-winning film producer who inherited the club from his dad. Gori brought the club Batigol and their first trophy in 20 years in the 1996 Coppa Italia, but he was also reckless, investing in risky TV ventures and losing £60 million in a messy divorce. The club couldn't escape the effects of his idiocy for long, and unsurprisingly by 2001 they announced losses of more than £30 million and an inability to pay player wages, triggering a fire sale and bankruptcy. The team was demoted to Serie B and given a chance to rebuild, but Gori couldn't pull together a deal to save the club and they were liquidated, beginning from scratch in the 4th division. In the end, it turned out Gori had extracted nearly £20 million from Fiorentina for himself, and while the team he nearly broke is back in Serie A, Gori is rotting in an Italian prison. 5. Kaiserslautern. German clubs tend to be more stable than others. The 50+1 rule, guaranteeing majority fan ownership, prevents owners from taking over and pumping money into clubs without supporter approval. And while this ensures big teams like Bayern stay dominant and are rarely challenged, it also means sides don't overspend and go bankrupt as often as they do in other leagues. But money worries can still arise. Kaiserslautern are 4-time Bundesliga champions and were founding members of the division, producing stars like Miroslav Klose and Michael Ballack. But success means responsibilities, and when the team hit financial difficulties in 2001, they couldn't afford their 50,000-seater stadium, selling it to the city of Kaiserslautern. Slowly, the lack of funds impaired the squad, and by 2006 they dropped to the 2nd tier, where they spent the majority of the time since, until, in 2018, they were finally demoted again. With no fan money during COVID and investor interest drying up, the Red Devils were forced to cut player salaries, and in 2020 filed for bankruptcy as a desperate measure to save the club from oblivion. They limp on, but relegation to the German Conference is beckoning. 4. Chelsea. After 5 titles and 2 Champions Leagues, Chelsea fans adore Roman Abramovich, but arguably he's only the second most important owner they've ever had. Back in the early 80s, the Blues were in serious trouble, having spent 2 decades trying to redevelop Stamford Bridge into an 80,000-seater stadium, only to suffer relegation in 1975 and lose pace with loan repayments. With £4 million in debt, the equivalent of £25 million today, the holding company which owned Stamford Bridge was sold off, making the Blues tenants in their own stadium, and the club slipped towards the 3rd division as a violent faction of supporters slowly made the Chelsea name synonymous with hooliganism. But then came Ken Bates. Having previously chaired Oldham and Wigan, the businessman had experience resuscitating clubs on the edge, and after paying just £1 for the Blues, he bought shares in the company which owned the bridge to prevent them forcing the team out, before providing funds to rebuild the squad. Having finished 18th in the 2nd division in 1983, 2 points above the drop, Chelsea won promotion a year later, and by the time Bates sold up, Stamford Bridge was fully refurbished and back under Blue ownership, while the club was a regular in the Champions League. For his trouble, he earned £18 million in the sale to Abramovich. Today, Chelsea is valued at £2.3 billion. 3. Malaga. Normally a Qatari takeover means an influx of cash for a football club, and so it proved at first for Malaga. The Spanish side, rescued from financial troubles in 2010 by Sheikh Abdullah Al Thani, initially spent freely and well, bringing in Salomon Rondon, Santi Cazorla and a teenage Isco, while manager Manuel Pellegrini, just off a stint at Real Madrid, took them to a Champions League quarter-final. All was sunny on the south coast. But having a bored royal for an owner means interest can wane fast, and so it proved with Al Thani. Players were sold whenever offers arrived, and a failed investment in Andalusian real estate killed off Al Thani's enthusiasm for good, with debts subsequently mounting and a European ban following. Before long, the Sheikh was paying his own expenses out of club coffers, running up a €100 million bill, and bringing the side into further disrepute by preventing them from supporting LGBTQ rights, resulting in a Spanish judge ruling he could have no more to do with club management in February 2020. However, drastic measures were still required to keep Malaga alive, and at the end of the 2019-20 campaign, the Boquerones were forced to lay off the entire first-team squad to make ends meet. Now in their 3rd successive year in the 2nd division, we wonder if they'll ever return to the big time. 2. Leeds. Now among the most entertaining sides in the Prem, Leeds have put their dark days behind them, but it took nearly 20 years. Much like now, the Peacocks were exciting and dangerous in the early 2000s, with coach David O'Leary moulding talent like Harry Kewell, Mark Viduka and Rio Ferdinand into a side which managed 3 consecutive top 4 finishes between 1999 and 2001, qualifying for the Champions League. But foolishly, they thought the good times would last forever. Chairman Peter Ridsdale took out huge loans to augment the squad, assuming European football would cover repayments, and when they came in 5th in 2002, they were forced to sell Ferdinand to Man United, leading to disagreements which saw O'Leary jump ship. Before long, stars were leaving left and right, and relegation swiftly followed, forcing the club to grant free transfers to reduce the wage bill, as well as sell off the stadium and training ground. Managerial turnover, with 10 coaches in 6 years, made it almost impossible to rebuild, and in 2007 the team finally went bankrupt, incurring a 10-point penalty and dropping to the 3rd tier for the first time ever. It would take another 4 takeovers, 12 managers and 12 years to get back to the Prem. 1. Glasgow Rangers. When Steven Gerrard's Rangers won their first title in a decade back in March, it was proclaimed as the 55th in their history, a world record. But some critics would beg to differ. That's because the club technically operates as a different company from the one founded back in 1872, following a financial meltdown in 2011. The root cause of the collapse was former owner Sir David Murray, whose tenure brought stars like Paul Gascoigne and Tore-Andre Flo to Ibrox, but also saw the team run up £82 million in debt. Keen to fill that hole, in the 2000s Murray introduced a financial tool called an employment benefit trust to pay players, as a way of avoiding tax, but the government took exception and so began a long legal war, as HMRC pursued the club for around £50 million. Murray made his exit, selling the side on to David White for £1, but White held back a further £9 million from the authorities and failed to disclose the club's accounts, with the result that the team was denied a licence to play European football in 2012 and docked 10 points in the SPFL. Eventually, Rangers entered administration and lost their players, who refused to transfer their contracts to the new company after the Light Blues were placed in the 4th tier of Scottish football. It took them 4 years to return to the Premiership, but thanks to Stevie G, one of Europe's greatest clubs is flying once again. So those are 10 terrible decisions that bankrupted clubs around Europe, but which ones caught your eye and which clubs could be heading in the same direction? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, drop us a like and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell and you'll never miss an upload. We'll see you next time.